Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. I took a pause from covering issues related to Palestine and issues related to the upcoming presidential election this November. Now the pause is over. I may have another pause at some point, but I wanted to go back and discuss Palestine again because of a really significant story in my view, and it's been covered by all the major mainstream news outlets, as well as by some alternative news outlets. Let me put on my spectacles and read you this story. Again, it is very disheartening. It's from the Associated Press, and I can't imagine why this happens. Well, unless it's intentional. I can't imagine why it would happen unintentionally. And apparently, Israel is saying it was intentional, but they were targeting Hamas. I will let you reach your own conclusions rather than me trying to put noise out there, which may filter how you understand it. So here is the headline. Israeli strike kills at least 33 people at a Gaza school. It is a UN Gaza school. The military claims was being used by Hamas. That is the justification for hitting civilian targets all the time. It is written by Wafa Sharafa and Sami Magdi. It is dated 8:36 p.m. today. So really, it was only about 1 hour ago, my time. Dateline, Deir al-Belah, Gaza Strip. An Israeli strike early Thursday on a school sheltering displaced Palestinians in central Gaza killed at least 33 people, including 12 women and children, according to local health officials. The Israeli military said that Hamas militants were operating from within the school. It was the latest instance of mass casualties among Palestinians trying to find refuge as Israel expands its offensive. A day earlier, the military announced a new ground and air assault in central Gaza, pursuing Hamas militants it says have regrouped there. Troops repeatedly have swept back into parts of the Gaza Strip they have previously invaded, underscoring the resilience of the militant group Hamas, despite Israel's nearly 8-month onslaught. Witnesses and hospital officials said the pre-dawn hit at the Al-Sardi school, run by the United Nations Agency for Palestinian Refugees, known by the acronym UNRWA, the school was filled with Palestinians who had fled Israeli operations and bombardment in northern Gaza, they said. The hospital initially reported that 9 women and 14 children were among those killed in the strike on the school. The hospital morgue later amended those records to show that the dead included 3 women, 9 children, and 21 men. It was not immediately clear what caused the discrepancy. An Associated Press reporter had counted the bodies, but was unable to look beneath the rubble. Separate strikes in central Gaza killed another 15 people, nearly all men. Ayman Rashed, a man displaced from Gaza City who was sheltering at the school, said the missiles hit classrooms on the 2nd and 3rd floors, where families were sheltering. He said he helped carry out 5 dead including an old man and 2 children, one with his head shattered open. It was dark, no electricity, and we struggled to get out the victims, Rashed said. Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, the spokesman for the Israeli military, said it carried out a precise strike. A precise strike based on concrete intelligence that militants were planning and conducting attacks from inside 3 classrooms? I'll read that again. Were planning and conducting attacks from inside 3 classrooms. He said only those rooms were attacked. Pause. Well, if that's the case, then why were those children killed? Were those children a part of Hamas? Were they involved in the planning of operations against your country? Is that what it was? I am trying to be careful and cautious and to abide by my self-regulations that I said I would, but when things like this happen, I must admit, it becomes very hard. It is very hard because my heart is literally broken when these things happen. I find it hard to continue on even reading the story. I mean, I will read the story, but it's hard. It's hard to read the story like this without commenting in the way that I am. And I have such negative feelings in my heart right now that I really want to vocalize them, but I am holding myself back. Because what point would it be? I'm sure you can imagine what I'm feeling, especially those of you who have been watching my podcast for a while. You know what I think. You know what I believe. I have nothing really to hide except for the fact that I'm trying my best to speak about events and not to get overly emotional and to verbally attack countries, because there is no point to that. All that matters is that the current terrorist operation in Gaza ends. It ends. And supposedly a week ago, it was supposed to end. I thought that based upon that report, that it would end by now, or at least a piece of my brain thought so. The rest of my brain was suspicious, and I guess the suspicious part is the part that was right. Continuing. We conducted the strike once our intelligence and surveillance indicated that there were no women or children inside the Hamas compound, inside those classrooms, he said. Pause. If their intelligence and surveillance indicated that there were no women and children inside the Hamas compound, then why were women and children killed? That's a reasonable question. I guess their intelligence and surveillance is really crappy. It must be really, really crappy for a first world country, a country which claims the kind of military superiority that they claim, not to have good enough intelligence and surveillance to know that there were women and children, despite the fact that they said, no, there is not, despite the fact that there were women and children inside the compound. Was there actually surveillance and intelligence conducted? Was anything actually collected? That is only a question. That is not an answer, because I don't know. But the people who didn't know, they know. Somebody has to know. But they're not talking, at least not to the press, and certainly not to me, living here in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, a long way from the once Holy Land. Continuing. We conducted the strike once our intelligence and surveillance indicated that there were no women or children inside the Hamas compound. Come back to that again. No women and children. But there were. Gary said that there were around 30 suspected militants in the 3 rooms. He said the military had confirmed killing 9 of them and displayed a slide showing their names and their photos. He provided no other evidence to substantiate the military's claims. Pause. No other evidence. Wouldn't you think that if that evidence existed, if they actually had evidence based on intelligence and surveillance operations, that to prove that to the world, a world which has turned against Israel, governments around the world which have turned against Israel, except for my own country, of course, that they would want to provide that information? What that tells me, and this is only my guess, I have no way of knowing this, that there was no such information. There was no such surveillance and intelligence. Or if there was any, that it showed who was in there, but the IDF, the Israeli Defense officers, and the Israeli government simply did not care. Simply did not care. Casualties from the strike arrived at the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital in nearby Deir al-Balah, which had already been overwhelmed by a stream of constant ambulances since the central Gaza incursion began 24 hours earlier, said Omar al-Dawari, a photographer working at the hospital. Videos circulating appeared online to show several wounded people being treated on the floor of the hospital, a common scene in Gaza's overwhelmed medical wards. Electricity in much of the hospital is out because staff are rationing fuel supplies for the generator. You can't walk into the hospital. There's so many people. Women from the victims' families are massed in the hallways, crying, he said. The school was Nuseirat, one of several built-up refugee camps in Gaza, dating to the 1948 war surrounding Israel's creation. I wish they would put the word illegitimate. I'm sorry, but I wish they would put the word illegitimate before Israel's creation. Sorry. When hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled or were driven from their homes in what became the new state, the new nation state. Footage showed bodies wrapped in blankets or plastic bags being laid out in the courtyard of the hospital. Mohammed al-Karim, a displaced Palestinian sheltering near the hospital, said he saw people searching for their loved ones among bodies, and that one woman kept asking medical workers to open the wraps on the bodies to see if her son was inside. The situation is tragic, he said. Philippe Lazzarini, and I hope I pronounced that right, I do not know Italian, the Commissioner General of UNRWA, said in a post on X, Twitter, that 6,000 people were sheltering in the school when it was hit without prior warning. He said UNRWA was unable to verify claims that armed groups were inside. I will read that again. He said UNRWA was unable to verify claims that armed groups were inside. Now, people in UNRWA are not amateurs. They are not people pulled off the street to go in and do inspections. These are trained individuals. They are used to inspecting sites like this. So if they could not see that armed groups were inside, what that tells me, to be blunt, is because there were no armed groups inside. There were no armed groups inside. And I would dare the IDF to prove me something different, to prove me wrong. Please, please, prove me wrong. Show evidence that there were. Show me evidence that there were militants, armed groups sheltering inside the school. Show me that, please. Please. No, you won't, will you? No, you won't, because you have no such evidence. Because to you, Gaza and Hamas are the same. Your objective is not to kill Hamas, because you must know that you are not killing Hamas, that Hamas is surviving. You are killing Gazans. You are not killing Hamas. Hamas is still strong. They are hiding in tunnels. When all this is over, if it is over, Hamas will still be around. But those Gazans that were attacked, their bodies will be buried in graves, if they are lucky. Their bodies will be buried in graves if they are lucky. UNRWA schools near Gaza have functioned as shelters since the start of the war, which has driven most of the territory's population of 2.3 million Palestinians from their homes. Last week, Israeli strikes killed an UNRWA facility, hit an UNRWA facility in the southern city of Rafah, saying, I want proving, not saying. I don't care what they say. I want evidence. But that evidence will not be forthcoming, will it? It will never be forthcoming. And Biden does not care. It would appear that neither the Senate nor the House of Representatives, the Senate under the control of Democrats, the House under the control of Republicans, really gives a darn. They simply don't care. They are Zionists. They are Zionists. And so they don't care. These days, to be a Zionist is the same as being an anti-Palestinian. To be honest, it was not always that way. It was not always that way. Now, certainly Zionists had no love for the Palestinians, but the idea of equating the two, of saying that there is no difference between being a Zionist and an anti-Palestinian is relatively recent. I have no idea how recent, but it certainly did not begin with Theodor Herzl's Zionism. But I think that the seeds were planted with Theodor Herzl's Zionism, because when you are taking over the land of an indigenous people, the only way you can do that is with bullets and bombs. Bullets and bombs are the only way you can take over the land of an indigenous and aboriginal population. And so that is what the IDF is doing. Are they succeeding? They are succeeding in killing Gazans, in killing Hamas? No. Hamas is very much alive. Does Israel know that? Undoubtedly. Do they care? It would seem as though they do not care. Their objective would appear to be simply to empty out Gaza of Gazans. This whole thing is just so tragic. And nothing that anybody does, not these widespread demonstrations, not protests by the United Nations, not the fact that the vast majority of governments in the world have condemned Israel, that Israel is now a terrorist state and is widely regarded as such around the world. Well, except by the US government. Except by the US government. To me, that is significant. The US and Israel basically stand alone. We stand alone. I wish with all my heart that I were not an American. When I have traveled around the world and people ask me where I was from, for the last couple of decades, I have always said, I am an American and I am deeply sorry. And that is from my heart. I'm not just saying that to make an impression or to make people like me more. That is how I really feel. I am ashamed to be an American citizen. Ashamed. No one should want to be an American citizen. I don't know if there is a way to give up my American citizenship. What that would entail, I've never looked into it. I mean, could I give up my American citizenship and still live here? I can't even answer that question. Maybe I will look into it. Maybe I will look into that, because I do not want to be seen as a part of this. I want to be able to say that, no, I may live in the decrepit US, but I am not a citizen of that country. I have renounced my citizenship. That feels good. Saying that feels good. Doing it, I think, would feel even better. Okay, let's continue with the story. Israel launched its campaign in Gaza after Hamas's October 7th attack into Israel, in which militants killed some 1,200 people and took another 250 hostages. Israel's offensive has killed at least 36,000 Palestinians, according to Gaza's health ministry, which does not distinguish between fighters and civilians in its figures. Comment, nor should it. Nor should it. Nor should it. Israel blames civilian deaths on Hamas because it positions fighters, tunnels, and rocket launchers in residential areas. But who was bombing those civilians? Who is bombing them? It's not Hamas. It's the IDF. The IDF has agency. It can choose not to bomb them. It can choose to give statehood to Palestine, which is not my first choice. As I've said before, my first choice is Palestine from the river to the sea. But at least that would be something. But Israel will never do that, at least not under present circumstances. Continuing, far-right members of Netanyahu's government have threatened to bring down the coalition if he signs onto a ceasefire deal, a deal which, by the way, was already accepted by Hamas. Israel has routinely launched airstrikes in all parts of Gaza since the start of the war and has carried out massive ground operations in the territory's two largest cities, Gaza City and Khan Yunis, that left much of them in ruins. The military waged an offensive earlier this year for several weeks in Baraj and several other nearby refugee camps in central Gaza. Troops pulled out of the Jabalia camp in northern Gaza last Friday after weeks of fighting caused widespread destruction. First responders have recovered the bodies of 360 people, mostly women and children. Let me say that again. 360 people, mostly women and children. Were they Hamas? Or were Hamas people hiding among them? Poor things. Poor things. So you're willing to kill perfectly innocent people to get to people that you think are combatants? What a great moral compass that is. You have such a tremendous moral compass, but more on that as soon as I finish reading the article, which is will be in about 15 seconds. Killed during the battles. That is the end of the article. Now, I will approach this matter in a way that I don't generally approach this issue. And that is by putting a kind of spiritual slant on it. I have no problem doing that as a Bhaskarian critical realist. The late Roy Bhaskar combined Marxism-Leninism with spirituality. He called himself an Advaita Vedantist. That is a non-dualist Vedantist. I think that in reality, he was a Dvait Advaita Vedantist, meaning he believed in both non-duality and duality. For some reason, Bhaskar liked Shankara, the founder of Advaita, and for whatever reason, I think because he was influenced by the Indian guru from the 20th century, Aurobindo, that he liked non-duality. But I don't think that Bhaskar really was a non-dualist. I think he was a dualist and a non-dualist. In fact, in his writings, he talks about both. He talks about this world, which he refers to as relative reality, as being dual. And he talks about meta-reality as being non-dual. Well, that's Dvait Advaita, as far as I know. But for whatever reason, Roy was attracted to Shankara and his Advaita Vedanta, and so he always insisted, at least for the last 10 years of his life, that he was an an Advaitist. And although I disagree with him, I don't think he was. Certainly, Roy had a right to define himself however he wanted. My point in saying this is not to critique Roy, but to make a point that in critical realism, we have no problem combining a Marxist critique with spirituality. Some people do have a problem with that. I do not. I look up to Roy as my idol, I guess you could say, although that sounds somewhat not exactly what I'm trying to say. He's not my fanboy, so to speak, but I look up to him. I admire him. I respect him. And so when Roy talked about combining his spirituality with Marxism, Leninism, I look to that as my standard. That is the standard for me. Now, I am not exactly a Advaitist. I am not a Hindu at all. I agree with some aspects of Hinduism. There are some Bhaskarian critical realists who are devout Christians, some who are devout Muslims, some who are devout Sikhs, and I'm sure others in other religions as well that I don't know about specifically. But in what I am, in how I look at the spiritual world, when I examine these kinds of events taking place in Greater West Asia, I say Greater West Asia to include Egypt, which is actually not in Asia, which is in Africa, Greater West Asia or the Middle East, same thing. When I look at Greater West Asia or the Middle East, what I see is one colonialist, imperialist power without the fear of God. That is my spiritual contribution to this. We need to both fear God and to love God, both. Both. One is not sufficient. If I only love God, but I don't fear him, then I may engage in bad behavior and thinking that I'm doing some good out of love. If I only fear God, but don't love him, I may behave in a very mechanical way, a very routine way, because it is not genuinely based on compassion, on metta, or maitri, loving kindness or compassion. And so, to me, both the fear of God and the love of God, or loving kindness, are both necessary to have a real, genuine grasp of the world. What is clear to me is that the oppressor of West Asia has neither one. Neither one. Any country in which people would march down the streets comparing Gazans to Nazis has no love. Any country which supports or does not rebel against the IDF killing women and children has no fear of God. Because if they had fear of God, they would know that when they leave their mortal frames, and that will come sooner than anyone thinks. Life is fast. It feels like just yesterday I was a teenager. Just yesterday. And now I am 68 years old. So if you are young right now, bear in mind what people always told me, that life goes fast. I believe them, but I had no reference point. Now I do. And I can testify to that. Life goes very, very fast. It's only an imaginary thing. I mean, life doesn't literally go faster. Time is a constant. But what happens is that your brain becomes accustomed to routine. And so as a result of that, there are no more surprises or few surprises. And when you know what to expect on a day in, day out basis, life appears to go more rapidly. When you are young, when everything is a surprise, life seems to go very slowly. That does not last. The older you get, the more of a routine you develop in your life, the faster life will go. What I try to do is to intentionally introduce new things into my life to make my life appear to go slower. And I think it works to an extent, but not entirely, because despite that fact, I still know what's going to happen tomorrow. Tomorrow, I suspect, will be like today. I may try to introduce some new components to it, but so what? It's still my life. I know what my life is. I have no more planning. My career is over. I am not planning for a second career or thinking about what kind of education would I need for it. I mean, I guess I could, but I don't want to go and get a new education. If I did, it might be in something like, I don't know, occupational therapy, which has always appealed to me. I've always liked occupational therapy. Occupational therapy also appears to be quite good in helping people with autism. And as an autistic, that draws me to occupational therapy. But regardless, I'm not going to do that. I am not going to become an occupational therapist. Simply won't happen. I like what I do. I like making podcasts. I like writing my book. I like talking with people, engaging with new people all the time, sharing my ideas, listening to other people share theirs. But despite that, despite the fact that my life is going faster and faster and faster, or maybe because of that, I realize that my time of death is rapidly approaching. I don't mean to sound gruesome. To me, death is not gruesome. To me, death is good. I look forward to dying because I believe in an afterlife, just as Roy Bhaskar did, although his concept of an afterlife was different than mine. He believed in some kind of reincarnation or transmigration. In fact, he even talks about his previous transmigrations or reincarnations in one of his books. How he knew that, I have no idea. That is not what I believe, but I have my own view of an afterlife. And I believe that what I do here will come back and haunt me for my eternity, or at least for a portion of my eternity. And I don't want that. I know a lot of Marxists, Marxist Leninists, any kind of Marxists are opposed to that kind of thing. But Roy Bhaskar was not. He lost a lot of his followers, if you want to call them followers, in the year 2000 when he expanded critical realism through his so-called spiritual turn. When he developed first transcendental dialectical critical realism, and second, the philosophy of meta-reality. Transcendental dialectical critical realism was epistemic or epistemological, meaning it was based on knowledge. The philosophy of meta-reality is based on ontology or being. The two belong together. They are not the same, but together they make up Roy's spiritual turn. I had my own spiritual turn. about 20 years ago, which I've discussed before, which gave me empathy or intersubjectivity. That woke me up. I had love for the first time. And now, as a Maoist third worldist, I can apply that love to the third world and to the fourth world. I don't know how many Maoist third worldists believe in spirituality. I know some who do, but the percentage, how do I know? But I'm one of them. I am one of them. I am happy to be one of them. And I will openly acknowledge that I am one of them. My spirituality and my communism go together. I see no point in separating them. Originally, I did. And so this podcast originally was simply devoted to my changing tendencies in communism, or primarily devoted to that. I did touch on other things from time to time. But for the most part, my changing tendencies in communism, beginning in June, Maoism, third worldism, or as I sometimes call it, socialism from below, third worldism, fourth worldism. Regardless of what you want to call it, I don't think that most of us are spiritually oriented, but who cares? I am. I am one of those who are. And I'm happy about that because I can have a consciousness of my own love for the third world and the fourth world. And Gaza is both. And I can have my own fear of God, realizing that if I do anything, anything, anything to kill innocent people, which has been happening around the clock in Gaza, that I will be justifiably punished. I must say that for those people in that imperialist country who are atheists or agnostics, and using Thomas Henry Huxley's definition of agnosticism, it's basically the same as atheism. It's basically saying, I will believe in a God when evidence is presented to me. It is not, as many people assume, being unsure. That is not agnosticism. That is being unsure. Huxley coined the term agnosticism to express his own philosophy of life, and he applied it primarily to a belief in God, but not exclusively. He also applied it to what would today be called scientific skepticism, meaning that you are skeptical about anything that is presented to you in science and you look for evidence. And so when I see these claims made by the Zionist entity that they targeted Hamas, and yet I see the people who died as women and children, what does that tell me? It's simple. The IDF was not targeting Hamas. Either that or they have a really bad aim. And they do not have a bad aim. They don't care. That is why the world, the governments of the world, minus the US, has been turning against them. You can fool people only so many times before they realize that not only are you a fool, but you are a fool that cannot be trusted. There are many fools in the world, many countries that are foolish, but that doesn't mean they necessarily can't be trusted. I mean, if you can trust people to be foolish, at least you can trust them to do something. With the Zionist entity, I cannot trust them in anything. I realize that in making this episode, I have violated my promise. I admit that. I did not know how long I would be able to go without violating my promise. And so I finally did. For those of you that were counting on my upholding my promise, I apologize. I did not do it to offend you. I did it as an expression of love and fear. Because I feel that if I do not confront the enemy, the colonizer, which is to me the enemy, then I am not worthy to be called a human being. I have no humanity. Does that give me courage? No. That's not courageous. That's simply being human. As I said in my previous podcast, Dr. Abraham Weisfeld, he is a courageous man, a truly courageous man. I love him deeply, and I respect him too. I am not, but I can still do my best to be a human being, to have humanity, and for better or for worse, that has meant in this particular episode violating the promise that I made. I guess I will try to conform to that promise in the future. I guess. But the worse things become, the more difficult it is for me to do it. And so the fact that I violated my promise this time is not a coincidence. It is because of my perception of how bad I think things have become. How, despite the fact that initially Israel bought into the truce under pressure from his flank to the right, he changed his mind. That is to be predicted. That is to be predicted. So what now will happen? I don't know. But what I do think is that the world is gradually being destabilized. And the US and Israel are now left out on a limb by themselves. The most powerful country in the world, supposedly, the US, is siding with Israel. As far as I know, no other country is. Certainly the country to my south, Mexico, 2 miles to my south, is not. It makes me wish I lived there. It does. And if I wanted to, I could. It's very easy for Americans to move to Mexico. The problem is, if I move there, I would not be eligible for Medicare, or I would have to come back into the US to get Medicare. It's complex. So realistically, I will probably not move to Mexico, but in my heart, that's where I would like to move. And I'm happy I'm only a couple of miles away from it. So at least maybe I can feel in or breathe in the air when the air is blowing from the south. That is Mexican air. At least I can breathe in that air and perhaps spit out or blow out the disgusting American air that I have to confront with on a daily basis. I'm sorry for dragging this on so long, but my heart would not let me stop. Actually, my heart is telling me to continue, but I realize if I continue, it will simply be repetition, and I don't want to bore anybody, so I will end it at this point. For the time being, this has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.